Hello everybody, welcome to the 2024 eMTB Shootout at Howler Bike Park. We got 14 bikes we're going to be putting to the test. Let's see how they do. All right, you guys, this is one of our most favorite projects of the year. Of course, your views, your comments help make it happen, but so does the awesome support from our sponsors. Oh no! Schwalbe Tire equipped all of the bikes with the same 2.4 Magic Mary front and rear in their super gravity casing and the Addix soft compound, so we could ensure all bikes were as level and could perform as optimally as possible.
And also a huge thanks to Fox Racing for kitting us out in some sweet looking apparel and also in some protective equipment that we were very much appreciative of this week.
And for this year's shootout, we've taken a lot of your comments and suggestions to heart. We've broken these bikes into two categories. Our first category of 5 bikes have a max price point of $6,000.
And for the rest of the 9 bikes, we've come in with a price cap of $10,000, which we think still lets everyone get top tier performance. So then, let's get into it. Starting off, we're going to go with the budget bikes. We've got 5 of them this year, all of which have been quite impressive, I'd say, in terms of the performance they were able to offer at that price tag. Starting off with the Ari Wire Peak Pro.
So the Wire Peak Pro retails currently for $56.99, and it is a 145 rear travel, 160 front 29er. All in all, I thought it came with a pretty decent spec. Of course, one of the nice things about Ari is that they really allow you to fine tune and customize aspects of the fit as well as componentry, so you can kind of make bikes fit into whatever price or style of riding you want. One of the more unique things about the Ari is that it was the only bike with the EP6 drive unit. It had a 635 Darfon battery, which is the same as its higher priced, higher level Timp Peak. However, that bike has the EP801. So yeah, the only drive unit or EP6 drive unit in the test, which we did notice on the trail, but obviously is part of the reason that this bike comes at a little bit more affordable price range. So
right, and for those who don't know, the EP6 is Shimano's budget kind of offering slightly cheaper price point, slightly heavier weight because it uses steel casing instead of a magnesium, and slightly reduced peak power output compared to the EP801 at just 500 watts instead of 600 watts peak power.
So Nick, you want to lead away with some thoughts on general performance of the Wire Peak?
Yeah, I think talking about the motor performance, you definitely felt it. It's just a little bit less powerful than the rest of them. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. It definitely shows on the trail. It's not like it held you back. It's not like riding a half-power super light bike. It's just a little bit less than the full-power bikes.
And for riders maybe in the market, where we felt that difference, was it on flatter, meandery, rolly trails, or was it really when you're putting the hammer down and you were on the steepest?
And that's what I felt, is the steepest pitches were really where that thing starts to just kind of gap behind the rest of the bikes.
And I think that's most notable because we ride in a group so often. You know, we're riding 4 different bikes or 7 different bikes if you include the camera crew, and quite quickly, if your motor is offering less power, you notice that everyone seems to be pulling away a little bit and you're working really hard to just try and keep up.
But the numbers are good, right? Like the bike rides pretty well. I felt like it's a very solid trail bike that can handle most of the uphills without issues. And then you have a nice, like, pretty supportive platform on the way down. Just probably gets a little overwhelmed in some of the bigger chunk and square edge hits that we found here at Howler Bike Park.
Certainly not meant for some of the bigger chunk.
Exactly.
That's it. It's a trail, all mountain bike, whatever you want to call it. And I think a solid one overall.
Sean, any standouts for you on the bike?
I mean, well, it looks great.
Okay.
I did find that the climbing position was pretty good.
Okay.
Despite its lack of power. Yeah, I mean, it handled flow trails pretty well. I think cornering I probably cornered that bike the best out of any of the other bikes that I've ridden this week. And flow trails are where it excelled.
Okay. I know you threw some pretty stylish jumps on that thing. I was pretty rad to see.
Yeah, it's a fun one. It's 56.7 pounds total weight. It's not a super light bike, but I think the geometry and the suspension platform definitely helped to offset that a little bit. It's a solid all-rounder. Maybe not the most exciting bike that we have here on test, but $5,700, fairly reasonable component spec on there. Everything seems pretty dialed, reasonable quality.
We're gonna kind of give every bike a score on a 1 through 10 scale. We'll start with Nick. So what do you think on this?
I think probably a solid 7.5 for this bike for the general rider.
Okay.
A 7 for me, but definitely a solid 6.
Okay.
Yeah, 7 for me as well.
Okay. Yeah, I'm on board there. Definitely lots to consider, but a 7 would be totally right and reasonable. Just a good solid bike for most riders. So, all right, let's move on to the next bike in our sub 6,000 group, which is the Canyon Strive On.
Oh, this bike is sick. Canyon Strive On is their Enduro eMTB, and for this year's group test we've got it in the CFR Underdog spec, their cheapest spec, which comes in at $5,799. And while it might not have a particularly flashy build kit, I think it's been a solid performer for us for sure. What were the first standouts for you there?
I was actually really surprised to see what I saw on this bike for the price point. Bosch Performance Line CX smart system, awesome. I personally really like the Fox spec on that, and I think it performs well and holds up. The DB8 brakes are kind of good until they're not good, which you can really get yourself in that position quickly on this bike because of how capable it is. Other than that though, I mean, I thought it was a pretty solid spec for the value, and like nothing, I would say maybe aside from the brakes, ever held me back, slowed me down, or made me think that this wasn't a bike that was $7,000 or $8,000.
Climbing performance, I mean, it's got obviously Bosch Performance CX is a very, very capable climber. Seated position I thought was great. It tracks well going up even the steepest bits of trail, loosest bits of trail as well.
Yeah, I think I agree, man. It's a great climber. I don't mind the looks either. I think Drew is old, and I think it's a great looking bike. It performs well on the downhill. It's just a slayer. Like it.
$5,800. Like you said, the DB8 brakes are maybe the only thing that I'd be really looking to change out on this to take it from what I think is a very good bike to a bike that I'd just be happy to have. You know, I don't think I'd, until things wore out or broke, inevitably being me, I think I'd buy this and hop on it and just enjoy it. And I think its performance overall is up there, not in the budget category, but in the overall category for sure. I think it's an absolute ripper.
So would you agree that it has the best value to spec to performance ratio?
It's impressive what they've managed to do, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on.
Worth noting, I think, that this is one of the few medium-sized bikes that we got on test. It's 475 reach in the size medium, and the large is 500. Would you buy a medium or a large?
Undoubtedly a medium, which at 6'2", 189 centimeters is, yeah, it feels a little bit stupid to say. It's something I've been called out on quite a bit. I did a long-term review of the standard CFR spec, slightly higher spec model of this bike in the past, and people were, yeah, telling me I was wrong for wanting to ride a medium, but it's what works for me at least. And yeah, Canyon's definitely pushed the envelope in terms of the reach numbers on this bike. 53 pounds, $57.99. I think super capable, well-rounded bike. I would probably say it's going to be a little biased towards the enduro or downhill rider, For
right?
sure.
The
It's
guy
not
who
a
wants to
super
shred,
playful bike.
jump, yeah, hit some big, rough and chunky terrain. Let's give it a score out of 10.
I think this is a solid 8 for me. This just does everything really well and does it for a price point it's hard to beat. So 8.5 for me.
I'm at an 8.5 as well. I could be higher, but the acoustics of the motor just kind of bring it down a little bit.
That's true. I forgot to bring that up. This was the loudest Bosch drive unit, and it was loud. I think it might have been the loudest bike, period, in terms of motor sound while pedaling.
Your score though, that in mind?
Sorry, yes. Score, I'll give the bike an 8.25. Yeah,
Things
really
that
think
you
so.
would change to make it higher?
felt a little heavier than the weight might suggest. Like I found it to be a little tough to kind of just change directions quickly, maybe in the air, move it or do the things I wanted to do with it. 445's chainstay length, mullet bike. I don't know if maybe that had something to do with it. There were definitely pros to it in the cornering. Like there were some awesome times where I was like, I absolutely love the way this bike corners in certain radius corners. And then there'd be other times where it left me feeling just a little different or unsure, but I don't know. I mean, it's a really, really good bike, and I would definitely not be bummed. Like you said, like I wouldn't feel bad buying one of those things and making it my own.
I'm definitely going to lift up the average score. For me, this is a solid 9.5. I think there's very little that I would change on it. Like I mentioned, I think it's a contender overall, and yeah, maybe without, it basically blows the rest of the budget bikes away in my mind. But there are still some good budget bikes to come, like the next one, which is going to be the Polygon Collosus N8E.
So the most affordable bike in the Shootout with a MSRP of $49.99, but on sale, I think we looked it up for sub 4, right?
I think it's just over 4, but
okay,
still.
Yeah,
crazy
so
money.
Yeah, an extremely affordable bike with a pretty, I would say, impressive build for that price point, even before the sale price comes into play. Aluminum frame, there's 6-bar suspension platform. Comes with Fox 38 performance and a Float X2 rear shock. It's got an EP801 drive unit with a Shimano 630 watt-hour battery. I think that's pretty cool. It's not a, third-party vendor battery, so that's pretty neat. Geo on this 160 29er is, I would say, pretty squarely in the enduro, DH enduro balanced category. So Robert, how about you lead us away here with the N8E?
Yeah, like you say, planted, kind of confident, comfortable, feeling bike overall, both up and down the hill. Definitely not the most sprightly of climbers in the group, but EP801 drive unit has been solid and it's comfortable. The geometry, I think, is pretty well sorted. There's a few bits here and there I'd maybe change by 10 mil or so, but it's not bad overall, and I think for the money especially, it packs quite a lot of performance. I did mention in its individual review video, I don't think the overall look of quality is maybe quite there compared to some of the other bikes, but I think when you hit the trail, the overall feeling of quality and how it rides is absolutely okay.
Okay, Nick?
Yeah, I gotta echo, it just doesn't look that great. Outside of the looks, I think, it's very planted the entire time. Like Robert said, it has a lot of traction on the uphill, it has reasonable power. On the downhill, it feels much heavier than stated weight to me. It just rides kind of dead.
I think this bike, I flipped between agreeing with you and disagreeing with you so often. I don't know if, it's got quite a tight rear end, so maybe there was times where I'd pop up onto the back wheel and be like, oh, actually, once you get it up there, it's quite short and maneuverable and snappy, and you can flick it into corners okay. But then there were also times where I was like, oh, I pulled for that gap and it really hurt my back.
It was interesting. The weight is undeniable, but I think we also agreed that with the money saved, you could probably get a better wheel set, bar stem combo, and you could probably drop a pretty, a noticeable enough amount of weight to really improve the ride. But the suspension platform, I do think, was more of like a thuddy, planted kind of a vibe rather than like the lively, fluttery feel. And I think that combined with the weight meant that it wasn't maybe the bike that you're just like hopping side to side on the trail, finding the little side hits, but totally a very capable bike, and one that when traction was scarce and we were charging down the gnarly rocky trails, it never felt nervous or twitchy, or I wasn't comfortable going down some steep stuff.
And I think for that $5,000 price point, the spec that they've managed to pack on this, as they continue to do with all of their bikes, is really quite impressive.
Good.
This level of spec at that price point is ridiculous, and the overall impression of quality when you're riding it is boosted that little bit by that.
Who do you think's ideal consumer, Sean?
Probably somebody that's more just getting into riding a mountain bike or an e-mountain bike. Maybe somebody that wants to get into a little bit more tech, but not super gnarly, just straight down the chute.
7.25 for me. It's a general all-arounder that can do most of the things that doesn't inspire me.
Okay, Rob?
For me, it's a bit higher than that. I'm going to go with an 8.5 on it. In this value category, I think for the spec that you're getting for the money, the overall feeling of quality on it, it's yeah, pretty solid.
I was right around a 7.5. It just wasn't a very inspiring ride for me, but still worked well for an e-bike.
Okay. 7.75 for me. I think, like you said, there are pros and there's cons. I think for the rider, you said, who doesn't have the aspirations of watching videos and being like, I'm gonna nose press every little side hit and try to, you know, kind of jump manual stuff, or be really playful and lively and want the lightweight e-bike with a poppy rear end. It's going to be a really good offering and an insane value. Like, I mean, it's undeniably good value, and the suspension platform works and does what it's supposed to do, which is smooth out really rough terrain. So yeah, I'd say a pretty sweet bike overall, and one that most of us enjoyed riding quite a bit.
Absolutely. Moving on, let's hit the Salsa Notch Diora.
All right, so the Notch is actually a bike we just picked up at Sea Otter Classic and pretty much drove straight here with. It's a 160, 170 bike, 29-inch wheels, also a size medium, right? Because, and incredibly...
Even more so crazy than Canyon.
Way crazier, because the medium's got a 498.9.
Well, originally I asked for a size large. You know, that's our typical go-to, and I don't know about you guys, but I wasn't expecting Salsa to come in so bold. 520, maybe even 25 mil reach on the size large, which is pretty extreme. But also it does have one of the steeper, if not the steepest, seat tube angle on test, 80 degrees, or 79.9 if you're going to be picky, which definitely helps to offset that. And for our size medium, I think put us in a pretty comfortable place.
Oh, yeah.
Overall wheelbase, though, was still on the longer side. It was on par with the Orbea Wild at 1277. The Propain was longer at 1281, as well as the Pole at 1280. So for those who maybe aren't too familiar with Salsa, I mean, when they're making a bike with a wheelbase that's on par with Propain and Pole, that's kind of gives you an idea how gnarly they went with this thing. So
this is a Bosch power bike, another one in our group test, but interestingly they opted to go for the 500 watt-hour battery in it, and they're really relying on some riders wanting to use the Power More range extender, which you can fit to this to boost it by a further 250 watts. Definitely not a light bike in our group. 57.8 pounds without the range extender, and then pushing it up into 61 pounds with the range extender. What were your initial impressions on it, Nick?
You know, that long wheelbase, kind of forward seating position, up high on the bars, it climbs really pretty well for out of these budget bikes. I was impressed with the climbing capability. It definitely stays planted. On the downhill, I felt like it was easy to overwhelm. Like, I felt like the front end kind of packed out a little bit. It might just be spec. And overwhelming the brakes was fairly easy as well. So
yeah, for me, this was one of the last bikes that I hopped onto, and I was expecting it to be quite, I don't know, maybe an uninspiring bike, but when I did hop on it, got it set up, I was quite impressed by its overall capabilities. I really enjoyed how it cornered. I thought the general spec selection was solid. It's nothing flashy, but it all worked pretty well. It was my first time on the Domain, and I kind of got along with it reasonably well. It didn't leave me too much to complain about.
This was one of the bikes where I was judging a book by its cover, per se. I did not want to hop on it, and then as soon as I did, I was like, oh man, this thing is actually pretty darn sweet. It was probably one of the quietest bikes that I rode down the hill. I didn't overwhelm it like Nick did, but I probably wasn't pushing it as hard. Yeah, I was just pleasantly surprised at how well it rode.
When you're looking at everything, what you want to pick first is either what you've already ridden and you know you like, or what attracts you and you're most curious about. And I was not attracted or very curious about that bike. And then when I got on it, I would say within about 3 minutes, I was like, I think this might be the most comfortable seating position of any bike I've ridden so far at the shootout, and maybe, you know, recently. It just put me in a really good position. I liked it. I was like, I just feel like I'm in a great spot, right, at 5'11". And it got up the hill fine, traction was good. I thought it had a pretty supple suspension feel, which lent itself in the form of traction and compliance, comfort. It was a really solid climbing bike for sure. Getting it onto the downs might have been a poor brake lead. The brakes didn't inspire a ton of confidence in me, and it was the smooth, supple platform I thought worked good up until a point, and that point would come when you really started hammering something, and then you needed to brake hard last minute, and then the brakes maybe weren't doing exactly what I wanted, so I had to grab them harder later because they didn't do what I wanted to 10 feet earlier, and then the fork starts packing down.
I did find that potentially, well, no, not potentially, just absolutely, factually, the whole bike was lacking a little bit of support. It was nice and plush off the top. It ramped up okay. I hit some fairly gnarly stuff on it without feeling the bottom out, but the middle is a bit soft and mushy, which only goes to add some extra overall feeling of weight.
I think for me personally, where and how I like to ride, I'm going to give it a 7.25. Just like I said, I think it's a really good bike. However, it lacks a little bit of the support and push and pump I want. It's heavy. And then the way it reacts when I do overwhelm it quickly, and what that results in usually happens mid or exit of a corner. Those are other things that would draw it down.
Sure.
Yeah, I was right around a 7.5. I mean, it's heavy compared to some of the other bikes, and I think a little expensive for the spec you get when you're comparing it to some of the other budget offerings that we have on test as well.
For me, it's a 7.5. I had a good time on this bike, but it's not my favorite of the group for sure.
Yeah, for me personally, it's a 7. I felt like I overwhelmed it a few times, and again, probably spec. But for its intended consumer, it's probably not that bad of a scoring of bike. It's for your general everyday rider. I think it's a really solid offering.
And moving on from the Salsa Notch Dior, we're going to check out the last in our budget bike group in this test, the Superior EXF 9039B.
Well, it's not raining, but we got some stiff links here. Let's hope this stuff dries out and we can have a little bit of fun putting these bikes on some drier trails, hopefully. So retailing at $59.99. It's a 160 mil front and rear wheel travel, 29-inch wheeled. I don't know. I don't know if I would go as far as to call it a full-blown enduro bike. 64-degree head tube angle, 485 reach on the size large. What was the weight on this bike, Rob?
56.9 pounds.
Okay. So yeah, it's
on the heavy side.
Definitely lighter than the Salsa.
But that is with a 750 watt-hour Bosch power tube battery in there to go with the Bosch Performance Line CX Gen 4 system, which compared to the Salsa, 250 watt-hours more battery capacity and still a decent chunk lighter weight.
And I would maybe argue better spec.
Yep.
So we got
for the money for
Lyric
sure.
Select, Super Deluxe Select.
DT Swiss H1900 wheel set. Really nice to see at this price point.
A little better brake set, although it has 180 rotors front and rear, which we did say was kind of a letdown for the capabilities.
Definitely a miss, but at least a cheap upgrade.
Yeah, very true, very true. So, Sean, lead it away with the Superior.
Yeah, obviously Bosch Performance CX, so it climbed really well. I thought the rear suspension platform was pretty decent and planted going uphill. Going downhill, I did feel like the bike liked to buck a little bit. Could have just been a rebound issue on the shock, or just the sections of the trail that I was riding it on.
Nick, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I was pretty impressed with this bike. I thought that it was a pretty decent all-rounder. Again, the colorway is great. I really liked the look of the bike. The suspension platform, when I first picked it up, I wasn't overly expecting great things with kind of a cross-country-ish look to that high top tube mount. But on the way down, I was impressed. It tracked really well. I felt like it kind of muted out the trail a little bit, but also felt like it was supportive in where I wanted it. You can move it reasonably well.
Sure.
Yeah. I also was pleasantly surprised with this bike. It was capable, it was comfortable. I felt pretty confident on it. You know, I mean, it's not a top tier high performance bike, but not everybody needs that. And it definitely did most of the stuff I wanted it to do. Like some of the other bikes in this category, maybe I was a little more timid, or maybe I braked a little bit more, you know, because it just didn't quite have the exact confidence inspiring feel I wanted. I thought the suspension was definitely not like at the Polygons level. I thought it was a little bit more lively, maybe not to the level of the Salsa, but like it was also a bit lighter. So that kind of meant it was a little easier to get off the ground and move. I thought it was a little bit more playful of a bike.
I'm going to preface my talking segment on this bike by saying we've got 180 pounds, 160 pounds, 180 pounds testers who got along pretty well with the bike. At 220 pounds, I did not. Rear shock setup to get the 30% or so sag. On the rear end, I was pretty high up in the pressure range, and with that pressure also came incredibly fast rebound, regardless of what I set it to. Fork also didn't feel fantastic, but was certainly better. But the overall riding impression for me, it became very stiff off the top. When both for climbing, it was almost completely locked out while I was pedaling it. And then on the way down the hill, it was, again, not very sensitive off the top. And then when I did blow through that initial firm kind of platform, it really blew through it. I think just for a rider of my weight, this is not a tune that is set up to work at all. Yeah, just, I was underdamped, just not feeling like it was giving me the confidence at all to push in any way, up or down the hill.
Okay. So with those complaints, what's your score?
I can't give it anything more than a 5. It just didn't work for me at all, but clearly for you guys, it worked a little bit better, and I think your score is going to be a bit better than that, right?
Yes, I give the bike a 7.25. You know, I think nothing amazingly stood out. Nothing was like an absolute deal breaker for me. I thought it was just a pretty good all-around bike. So yeah, 7.25.
Yeah, I was at a 7.25 as well.
Okay.
I mean, it rode well, but I still preferred riding the Salsa, which I scored a little bit higher, and yeah.
I think the looks bumped me up to a 7.5. I really like the paint job on this bike, and it rides really well.
There we have it, the last of our budget bikes in this group test, the Superior EXF 9039B, a bike that, if you're maybe sub 200 pounds, works fairly well, but wasn't my pick of the litter. Moving on, let's get into the over $6,000 up to $10,000 category, starting off with the Ari Timp Peak Pro.
All right, so last year's winner of the best bang for the buck enduro e-bike, the Timp Peak, still a very capable bike. I think everything that we talked about last year is there, and maybe even improved as some of the spec has improved this year. Full carbon fiber bike, $79.99, 170 front and rear travel, EP801 with a 635 battery. The only bike with SRAM Maven brakes. It had the silver model DT Swiss HX 1700 wheels, Exo Eagle T-Type drivetrain. I think a really solid bike overall.
170 mil travel, 51.2 pounds, and definitely a lively one.
Very lively. Sean, lead the way here.
Yeah, so we got upgraded this year with the EP801.
Yep.
I thought the bike climbed well, as a lot of our Shimano EP8 bikes have done. It was decently quiet in my opinion. I don't know if you guys agree or disagree.
Yeah, I thought it was quiet enough. I mean, it didn't stand out as being a quiet bike. It didn't stand out as being a loud bike either.
Yeah.
So,
I will say that I still think it has the integrations of yesteryear with the side power button, locking removable battery, flimsy battery cover. And I would just like to see like the integrations that we have on the Polygon. So the new button, new display, yeah, things like that.
and a better battery cover for sure.
Then a battery
Tighter.
Just go fully integrated.
aside from small integration quirks, will we say, that I don't think are deal breakers. The Ari continues to impress us. Definitely one of the bikes that inspires when you hop on it, just to charge hard, but still retains a lot of playful agility, fairly short rear end on it, light overall weight, snappy handling, just a fun bike overall.
Yeah.
How do you think it climbs?
I think it climbs really well. It's light, it has a lot of power. This is just a fun bike to be on. Like, you can just pick it up. It doesn't want to, lift the front end. It's nice and balanced in their weight there in the power delivery. But it's light enough that you can just like lift up and move it over something. I really like this bike. It's
Totally agree on the playfulness. I think this is, I don't know, would you say it's the most playful?
Most playful in that category, for sure.
Yeah, for sure in the category. And one of the most playful, I would say, period, in the full power e-bike category. It's pretty impressive what they can make a 170 mil full power e-bike feel like. It is just so playful. I think the suspension platform probably has a lot to do with it. It really wants to rebound quick and get high in the travel, which is awesome. The flip side to that, which we were kind of talking about in the last couple of days, is there are some situations, primarily cornering situations, where I'm coming down something steep and entering maybe like a high-speed berm, and I just feel like that same desire to spring up and get off the ground will sort of unweight the rear end or extend the rear shock. I should say it's not a traction issue, it's just that it makes the bike feel a little tall. So I'm having to kind of fight that little bit of a rise to keep the bike dipped over on the corner arc I want. And I don't know, maybe just running it with a little bit more sag, since it is so lively and active, could combat that. But that's like one of the only real negatives that I have with the bike.
I feel like potentially the SRAM Mavens are not helping that issue either, because they are so sharp. Like once you get on them and the rotor and pads are contacting, they're slowing you down.
Oh yeah.
So, any suspension effects from braking forces are going to be enhanced by the fact that the brakes are really doing their job very well. Definitely been interested in spending a bit more time on the Mavens and getting to learn how much power they have. They are
It's a great
ridiculous.
break,
Sean, standouts for you?
Its playfulness, its lightness. It looks pretty good. I would have liked to see the other paint job model that they have. But yeah, I mean, Ari is continuously nailing it with the Timp Peak. I think it's got one of the best build to dollar ratios in this higher spec category that we're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that spec list and it's one of the best on test without a doubt, and it's $2,000 cheaper than quite a few of the other models that we have.
Ideal candidate consumer, and what's your score?
Yeah, I'd give this bike a 925. If you're a shredder, if you want to play, you want to go in the steeps, you want to jump, like, this bike really does everything really well.
For me, it's an 8.5. I do really like it overall. I'm not sure it's the most forgiving bike to ride out there, especially in this travel category, but it's definitely a very fun one.
I find that the front end is stiff, like on par with the Orbea. And that was something I had a little bit of a critique on last year, was that same kind of like coming out of a corner where the bike's just a little bit lean and maybe there's like an edge of a rock or a root and I'm hitting that thing on the edge rather than straight on. Like, I'll feel that quick little deflection out of that front end and the stiffness, and it'll kind of reverberate a little bit.
Yeah, that stiffness for me is a benefit as a heavier rider, and I do like that more direct, precise feeling between my hands and the front wheel. But yeah, like I said, not the most forgiving bike, but definitely a fun one.
Okay, Sean?
I'm scoring it a 9. It was one of the bikes where, when we're doing our photo video sessions, where I hopped on it and I was just like, oh man, this is absolutely just the funnest bike I've been on. And yeah, it was just absolute hoot. But to your point, the front end definitely feels a little stiff, and I felt like I got a little bit of fatigue just doing full pulls.
My score on this bike, I'm really flipping between 8.75 and 9.
Sounds like an 8.875.
I don't know if I want to do that, but yeah, so we'll just say that. So right between an 8.75 and a 9. I think a really, really awesome bike. And a bike that I would say if most people, as they have been, right, coming up here at Howler and are like, I'm in the market for an e-bike, what do you think? And without having a 20-minute conversation about where do you live, what do you ride, what's your aspirations, this is a bike I would direct a lot of people to, and pretty confidently say this bike will do just about everything you want.
Definitely a pretty safe bet, I'd say. But maybe a bike moving on next that is slightly less of a safe bet, but definitely a bike that we've enjoyed a lot, the Cannondale Moterra SL.
Oof, that is a hot one. So the Moterra SL1, really interesting and I would say awesome genre of bike. It's a full power bike that has a smaller battery, sort of, that really kind of maximizes the playful nature of the bike. Not everyone wants or needs a 900 watt-hour battery, and some people would prioritize playfulness and a lighter bike, and this is right on the money with a 601. It's a 160-150 bike, mixed wheel, which I know is a point of contention for some. Sean, you want to lead us off here?
While we did tune it to its max setting, I felt like it was still a little bit behind some of our EP801 bikes. I do think doing lap after lap after lap, there was some heat degradation as well that kind of just slowed it down. I don't know if you guys felt that at all.
I didn't. I laid down a pretty quick climb lap on that bike actually, and I was like, well, maybe it's because of the weight. Weight on this bike again?
46.2 pounds, which for a 600 watt hour, 601 watt hour internal battery is pretty crazy. There's a lot of factors, right, and we're not going to get too deep into it in this test, but things from everything from trail conditions, which were constantly changing while we were out here at Howler Bike Park because of rain that kept on sort of drying out, refreshing, drying out, changing trail conditions, different battery levels when we're hopping on bikes because we're swapping them throughout the day and sometimes the batteries aren't always full. I agree. I don't think that this was particularly slow in the grand scheme of things. I think
Not to mention our own bodies.
Our own bodies, yes.
I was feeling pretty worn out after all these days of laps, but...
But circling back to the climbing, this bike in its factory position has a 62.5 degree head tube angle.
It was a thing I jumped on and did not like right away.
Yeah, I mean, I rode it at 62.5 back at home in Bend. Rob rode 62.5 during the media camp, and it likes to wander, I think, and at that 62.5 degree head tube angle, it also feels like it gets really long, so switchbacks were a issue. So we immediately switched it to, it's what, 63.7,
which is still slack, and I think plenty slack for a bike of this category. I do remember chatting to the Cannondale engineers at the media camp that I attended for this bike, and they had said that they kept on, in their test mules, slackening the bike out and kept on going, and they hit 62.5 degrees and they didn't see any major downsides to it. I guess for how we ride our trail conditions, potentially we don't agree with that, but in the 63.7 degree head tube angle setting of that headset, it was absolutely fine for me, and the geometry of this bike I think is really quite good. Also notable, it has the longest chainstays on test, which I think was a surprise with the rest of the theory of the bike, the lighter weight, more, I guess, playful-minded approach that they've gone for it. Yeah, I think also the resulting feeling out on the trail doesn't necessarily echo that it's got a super long rear end. I think with that mullet wheel potentially helping to offset it. But yeah, definitely a fun bike for me. Nick, do you agree?
I didn't love this bike when I first jumped on it. I think that it took me a minute to kind of get used to the slackness of the front end and the length of the rear. After riding it a little bit and taking on a little different, more flowy trails, I definitely got into how it rode and was more into it. It climbs well. It descends very well because of that very slack head tube angle. It was a benefit in the long run, but you pay the price on tight cornering and climbing.
I liked this bike quite a bit, but then there was also times where I was kind of, I don't want to say let down, but just it didn't do quite exactly what I expected it to. Obviously being so light at 46 pounds, I really thought it would be like a much livelier and playful jumping bike. and I don't know if it was the head angle, but I don't think that's it. I think realistically it's probably the longer chain stays. It kind of fell into a little bit of a weird in-between zone for me. Like the Geo said downhill, the amount of travel and the suspension platform were like not quite there. And then I was like, well, maybe it's like a super play jump bike, but again, then the Geo wasn't quite there. So I was kind of just in the middle.
But as an all-mountain bike, do you think it does just sit in the middle of everything?
I think it does.
Does everything reasonably well, but maybe doesn't set anything particularly alight?
Yes, I do think that. And that was kind of where, like, you know, we try to come into these tests without preconceived notions as best we can. We usually don't look at numbers beforehand. We don't really weigh the bikes, you know, very much beforehand. So we're not expecting something out of a bike, but it's when you pick it up, right, you can feel that it's light. You look at it and you're like, I'm expecting this bike should ride like this. And this bike was a bike that it didn't always do what I expected it to do. All that to say, I really like the bike, and it's a really good all-around bike, and it would be a bike that I would pick for a lot of riding because it is very capable.
And what's your score with that in mind?
With that in mind, I will give the bike an 8.25.
Sean?
At 8.75. I really like how the bike rode. I never questioned what I was going to hit or do. It just kind of like sent it and kept going, even if I may have been a little worried that I might flat spot another wheel. But
did any of you guys ever think about the flex pivot braking, that it didn't belong, anything at all while you were riding the bike?
No. I mean, I have absolute faith that Cannondale has done their work to make sure that this is suitable for this bike. You know, it would be ridiculous of them with a big engineering department not to put this through extensive testing, and because of that, I note it. Like, it looks different, but I trust that it's going to work, and didn't even come into my mind once while I was riding it.
Same, didn't even cross my mind.
For me, this is a solid 9, a very exciting bike, a very exciting category of bike, and definitely something I'm looking forward to seeing more of in the market.
I think I'll give this bike an 8.25. I really like the idea. For me, it just didn't quite fit one thing. You know, my personal preference is a different style bike, and that's okay. And this is probably a really solid bike for the all-rounder.
There we have it, the Cannondale Moterra SL1, a very exciting bike, and yeah, definitely one that we've enjoyed testing a lot. Moving on, we have got the giant Trance X Advanced E+ Elite 1.
Retailing at $10,000, right on the upper end of our limit here. It is the 140, 150 mil mixed wheel trail, all mountain. I would maybe favor it towards the trail category. 65.8 head tube angle, 1244 wheelbase, 480 or 487 reach, depending on the Geo flip chip. Impressive weight, right? 45.8 pounds without the range extender, and width was 48.6.
For this bike, Giant opted to go for the same full power drive unit, powered by Yamaha, the Sync Drive Pro 2. It's got 85 newton meters of torque and 500 watts of peak power. And then they powered it by just a 400 watt hour internal battery, but you can boost that by a further 250 watt hours with the range extender, pulling it up to a full power 650 watt hour battery capacity, which is why we've included it in the Shootout. Giant spec'd it with a bit of a mismatch of components in that it's got a 36 and a Float X shock, very suitable for this travel, but then it's got a Codar brake set with a 220mm front rotor, which seemed to suggest that they're wanting you to push it a little bit harder, but then the geometry is not that aggressive. So
yeah,
you may notice in a lot of the clips that we've got a different bar stem combo to the integrated setup that Giant ships this bike with. That integrated setup is interesting. It uses a wedge system that lets you adjust either the reach or the angle of it. We didn't get those wedges, sadly, for this group test, so it was just the stock configuration position that we had it, which felt very rolled forward, and the overall geometry I just don't think worked for any of us, right?
And long.
Long, and just generally more of a cross-country feeling cockpit for a bike that otherwise we wanted to ride fairly hard. For me, I still wasn't ever able to feel totally comfortable in the front end of this bike. I think a combination of a fairly steep head tube angle and just the steering geometry overall meant I wasn't able to push it through the corners as hard as the rest of it kind of suggested I might be able to. Did you feel the same?
Yeah, I had a real similar feeling of a lack of responsiveness in the front end and just not being able to really counter steer on this bike to really initiate my turns. So I had some issues. I felt like what you were saying earlier about it, it's kind of the bike, the giant spec this bike, kind of in a mystery of a blend of componentry and setup. So I'm a little lost on exactly what this bike is perfect for. It seems like a cross-country trail focused geometry and build and winning the stem, but then the bike wants to be pushed harder in the steep.
Yeah, mixed wheel, fairly stiff and stout frame, looks fairly aggressive.
Yeah, I didn't find it to be unresponsive on the steering department at a 65.8 degree head tube angle. I thought it was overly responsive, maybe. And so that kind of had me, I don't know, I guess feeling like the bike was really good on slower speed technical terrain, climbing, tight switchbacks, the areas where I was really focusing on like the turning steering of it and less the leaning turning of it.
Circling back to like climbing aspect, I felt this bike the Sync Drive Pro had a very like instant on in that boost mode. Like it was just spinning tire right away. Like it just wanted to go. And then it also is one of the only bikes where if you're resting your foot on the pedal while we're just sitting around, it just has a little twitch that it wants to go. And then integrations, like that handlebar button. I know some of you guys said that you were just accidentally clicking power modes. I never found that, but it is an interesting remote, I would say. And there is no real display. It's just got your LED hub right on the top tube.
Further on the integration side of things, the range extender on this bike, when fitted, regardless of what we tried to do with it, rattled like crazy, and it feels like a loose headset or any other sort of major rattle on a bike, and really detracts from the overall feeling of comfort and quality. And so we'd love to see, this is yet again another e-bike integration problem that we'd love to see improved. Just these are heavy things that are being strapped to these bikes, and they need more than just a plastic flexible bottle cage style holder to keep them solid on the bike. Yeah, without getting too far into the weeds on this, shall we hit some scores on this bike? Nick, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I feel like this bike doesn't quite know where it wants to be yet. It's kind of set up for that XC trail rider, and I think it would work well for that person. But maybe the spec choice is just a little bit off for that. So 7.25 for me.
For me, it's a solid 8. There's things that I'd love to change on it. I had this sort of slalom mentality when I was looking at it and the lightweight of it, that I just wanted to be an absolute ripper. Turns out that wasn't quite the bike that it was intended to be, but for more mellow flow trail and longer miles, I guess. Maybe with using slightly less assistance on it, because 400 watt-hour internal battery is going to run out fairly quickly if you're trying to hit boost laps. It wasn't the bike that I wanted it to be, but it's definitely a solid bike for a less aggressive rider. Sean?
Yeah, to that point, I'd give it an 8. I wasn't riding it as hard as you were trying to ride it, and I was focusing more on the trail or the flow trails side of things, and I thought it did pretty well and it jumped well, but certainly very limited in its application.
For me, it's a tough one just because, and I don't want to give it an unfair score just because the bike isn't for me. So I would say probably a 7.75 is where this bike would sit. I think for certain riders, right, this bike could definitely creep well into the 8.25 range. And again, just thinking about where Giant's headquarters at and those trails back home, I would find this bike to be efficient, playful, stiff, like it would be a ton of fun. So I think probably taking a hard look at your riding style, your terrain, and what you want out of the e-bike experience would be really important. And I think that head tube angle is probably the most polarizing number out of the bike. You know, I feel like if it was a 65 even, like that might change a whole lot about this bike for us on the trail and the way we like to ride.
Absolutely. Speaking of polarizing, we've got a very interesting bike up next, the Norco Range VLT.
So coming in at $9,089.99 is the 170/180 Range VLT, a big, beastly, burly, enduro, downhill-minded e-bike, mixed wheels. We have the size 3. I think the sizing structure is definitely worth taking a look at it if you're in the market. We opted to size down because Norco traditionally makes some heavier bikes, and e-bikes, just the weight of them give you inherent stability because of that mass, and so we wanted to have a shorter bike so that would allow us to manual and move the bike a little bit better to kind of compensate that 57.6 pound weight. Overall, though, I'd say the geo numbers were pretty on par, aside from the shorter reach for a descending focused bike with a high pivot suspension design, right? The chainstays seem short statically. At sag, they will lengthen, and as you go through travel, they will lengthen a little bit. Pretty dialed build, I would say. The Zeb Ultimate, Vivid Ultimate rear shock, which is probably my favorite rear shock at the moment. Bosch Power Tube 625, Performance Line CX with a smart system integration. 750 battery. Sorry, misspoke there. 750, thank you. GX Axis T-Type, Crank Brothers Synthesis E wheel set. Killer build overall, I think, and yeah, really solid. So let's get into the performance of the bike. Let's talk about the climbing first up, Sean. It's your least favorite thing to do.
I mean, we're on e-bikes, so I can't hate climbing that much. I don't feel like it felt like I was riding a 58-pound bike uphill. I felt was pretty planted for the most part, and I mean, it's also one of the quietest Bosch bikes, I think.
Yeah, pretty solid all around for sure. The descent, or I should say traction and rear wheel ground huggingness uphill and downhill is phenomenal on this bike.
When we cut in our kind of loam track off camber, this bike, because of that traction, you can hold the highest line and it just holds. And even if it slides down a little, it's going to catch again on the next little tiny thing. It has ultimate traction.
And when you get to, say, the more bike park style big berms, how did you find the cornering performance of the bike?
It does corner well. You can push it down into low corners and it does hold it, but I just felt a little awkward with the shorter front end.
Yeah, I'm saying that because one of the big kind of drawbacks that a lot of people have faced in the past with the higher pivot suspension designs is that they feel strange in the bike park because the wheelbase is extending.
Yeah.
But I don't think with that, that's so appreciated.
I didn't feel that at all, did you?
No, not at all. But what that high pivot suspension does manage to do on the way down the hill is really just let you turn your brain off and point your way down pretty much any line that you could imagine and hold on.
No matter how sketchy or slippery the trails got or how gnarly and chunky the rock gardens were, I was like, as long as I can somehow keep the bike vertical and the rubber beneath me and my body on top, I know I can go through anything. And it just went. Wasn't my favorite bike to jump. I also heard a fair bit of rattling in the frame, especially as the week progressed. Like yesterday on the flow trails, like going through some big berms and some braking bumps, I was like, gosh, I just really hear something rattling down near the drive unit, and that was a little annoying. But
we did also have an issue with the main upper pivot hardware braking in our first couple of rides on it. It was a pre-production bolt that we were sent as part of the media bikes. They say that they fixed it. Definitely the replacement that we got looked a bit sturdier.
Yeah, it was a hollow bolt that broke versus the solid ones that they replaced it with.
So far we've been having no more issues with that, thankfully. What about you?
It's a downhiller's delight. And I would say it's a vast departure from its previous generation bike, which was a tank and rode like a tank. I think this is, I mean, it isn't as playful, but it's still,
I would say it's less of a departure and more of a giant evolution. I think the intentions of both the last Range VLT and this Range VLT are the same. They've just executed it much better.
So we should do some scores on this bike.
Absolutely, Nick, lead us away.
8.5 for its intended purpose. This thing is a machine. It is so good at holding whatever line you want, eating whatever terrain you put in front of it, and you can climb super fast on the way up.
Yeah, I think for me, as long as you're in the right mentality of, just look at it. It's obviously a bike that's designed to descend very, very aggressively, and as long as you're in that mindset, it's fantastic. Solid 9 for me, I think.
Yeah, you guys nailed it. I'm at an 8.5. I think it is very poignant for specific riders. So, I mean, it wouldn't be a bike that I would choose for most of my riding, but for others, it would be great.
Yeah. 8.75 for me. Norco's done a very good job, I would say, with the next evolution of their VLT bikes. This thing, if like everyone said, if you want to just get up to the top, you want traction, and then you want to plow down some gnarly stuff and big drops, big jumps, it is a shredder for sure.
Absolutely. With that same mindset, in consideration, another bike that's absolutely designed to be pointed down some rough and rowdy terrain, moving on to the Orbea Wild.
So our Wild comes at $9,977. Rob did a little bit of customization on the build through the Orbea My-O program. Worth noting that you can go do that on your own, kind of get everything that you want spec'd and picked. And Rob obviously really loved this bike last year. I believe it even won our overall eMTB of the Year award. So similar to the Pivot and the Ari Timp Peak, we are very excited to have the Orbea back to see how it can defend its title. It is a 170 mil 29er bike, very light at 50.8 pounds for a full power bike. Performance Line CX, 625 battery, smart system, XT stuff, DT Swiss 350 hubs, their in-house Oquo wheels, GX Eagle T-Type, solid build all around.
And you would hope so, given that I went in and totally customized it. There are other brands in this test that will allow you to do something similar, but Orbea's My-O program is very extensive.
Speaking of preferences and customization, it doesn't seem like customizing the brakes from Euro to US spec was all that easy. Nick, why don't you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so the integrated head tube routing that comes through the headset is a pain to work on. I mean, we were switching back and forth between Euro and US setup on brakes. It took us a good 20 minutes to swap those around, and it is a lot of work. There's several different spacers and proprietary cup systems in there that you have to take out, route the tubing through. Probably not something you're going to do unless you're initially setting up the bike and then it's done.
And we didn't have any other issues with the system aside from that. Sean, how do you find it?
Well, climbing, again, echoing our Bosch sentiment, it is meant to go uphill in a rather fast manner. I did find that for me anyways, when the trail got steep or that the front end got really light and wanted to wander, it could just be that the bars were pushing, 820 maybe. Drew?
I would say it has a little bit of a stiffer platform, both up and downhill, which has goods and bads. So yeah, efficiency, speed, transmission of power, all areas that the bike shines. Maybe not as comfortable for long days in the saddle where there's a lot of rock or roots that you're climbing. It's not uncomfortable by any means, but it's not quite that pillowy couch feel that some of the other bikes have. Moving into the downhill side of things, some of them transfer over for sure, and some not so much. I would say the bike descends very well. I do feel that the suspension platform is on the more performance, sporty side of things. I also think that the frame is one of the stiffest frames that we have, which was kind of the same thing I said last year, and here again this year. We've been fighting for traction. And it's to me, it's a bike that you really have to be on and you have to ride it with an aggressive mentality. It doesn't allow a huge margin of error for forgiveness in terms of traction. Outside of that unique experience, the bike's an amazing descender. It is fast, it is confident, it inspires you to be playful and attack the terrain in all but that one scenario. So yeah, I mean, it is a bike that makes you want to ride super fast and charge hard, but you don't always want to ride that way.
If I'm going to choose a way that I want to ride and choose a bike that I want to pull out of the garage and, you know, the feelings that it conjures up, the Orbea is really special. I didn't ride the bike a lot this year at all. I just wanted to hop on it and confirm what I already knew and leave these guys to put a little bit more miles in it. But it took not even half a lap and I was already like, yeah, this is still by far the bike that when I hop on it, I just want to go fast. I just want to attack, and it lets you do that. It really helps you do that.
I have very few bikes that I pick up and instantly do they make you just want to ride fast, and that's something I want in the bike that I would choose. This bike is ultimately confidence inspiring. Yes, the bars are a little wide. I'd like them cut down a little bit, but it's still fine. Platform stiff. It gets you up the hill fast, and it does the exact same thing on the downhill. Every pedal stroke you put in, every pump of the trail you put in, it rewards you with more speed and more ability to attack trail. And I love this bike. I love everything about this bike, and it gives you a feeling that a lot of bikes don't give you.
Sean, score and final thoughts.
I'm an 8. I'm not somebody that wants to attack the trail all the time, and there are days where I have an off day, which I've had here. And if I was riding that bike, I would have had a miserable lap or two.
I'll give the bike a 9, right? I think that's a pretty solid spot to be, and I fully concede and accept that this is the race machine.
The Orbea makes me wild, and for that reason, definitely for a more race-minded person who's on board with that mentality, it's so close to perfect. It's 9.75 for me. Nick?
Yeah, and barely any changes for me. So again, I'd go 9.75.
Speaking of another bike that is so close to perfect, the Pivot Shuttle LT.
Yes, the $9,999 Pivot Shuttle LT Team XTR, a 160-170 bike that rivals the Orbea in terms of its inspiration, but certainly delivers that in a slightly different feel. Shimano EP801 drive unit with a 756 watt-hour Darfon integrated battery. Team XTR spec means full XTR drivetrain and brakes, Fox factory suspension. I think the pricing seems fairly reasonable. Geometry-wise, we went for the size medium for this year's test. We've extensively talked about the medium versus large debate for this bike. Not huge gaps in the sizing, but they sit kind of either side of our preferred numbers, so we opted to go for the medium. It served us pretty well this week, I think. Climbing performance
is outstanding. This bike has a ton of grip and still feels light. It doesn't lift for me.
Well, it is light. It's 51.3 pounds for this build.
Yeah, it is light. Like but it also rides light, right? Like you can have a light bike that rides heavy, and this is the opposite of that. This bike feels inspired on the climbs to choose any line you want, hold your traction. It's got a very nice blend of slackness in the front end, but isn't so slack you're wandering around.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of my favorite bikes to climb, and it's quiet, not annoyingly humming in my ear. I think Pivot did a great job with the acoustics of their frame construction, and I mean, their frame exudes quality anyways.
Probably one of the best protective units as well. Obviously, Pivot being in Phoenix, their trails out their back door are extremely rocky and rough, and I know for a fact some of the guys in charge of developing and testing these bikes bash those things into rocks a lot. So
well, when we were there last year on these bikes, I definitely smoked that bash guard and it held up really well. I can definitely attest to its durability there. On the way down the hill, I don't think we need to say that much, right? This thing really rips. It's pretty versatile, not like just a plow-minded bike, also not a nervous bike. It sits in the middle of the category, does everything pretty well.
What would you say to riders who maybe see that rear shock and write the bike off? because it's not early enough.
It does the job very well. We've never had any issues with it overheating on the longest descents that we've ridden this bike on. Plenty of support, and the stroke support's great.
Yeah, for me, it's a bike that I can hop on, and no matter what I'm looking at, if it's, you know, a wood step down in greasy conditions, if it's a gnarly rock garden, if it's like our racetrack, you know, and I'm trying to put down the fastest race time on off-camber, tight, switchy slalom corners, I'm like, that's kind of the first bike that I want to grab for most of those challenges when it's time to go.
Nick, lead out the scoring for us, please.
Yeah, I'll give this a bike a 9.5. I think the only thing it's lacking is a little bit of the sizing changes, and other than that, that's like the tiniest complaint. This is a great bike for nearly any condition, and most riders would be great on this.
Absolutely. Solid 9 for me. Very little I would change, just not the bike that I would. No, if you want to give me one of these, I'd happily accept it. Sean?
I'm gonna go with a 9. It's light, it's playful, not as playful as the Ari Timp Peak.
Does the fact that this is a Shimano EP801 drive unit, would that be a reason for you to not consider or want to buy this bike?
Didn't pop into my head
Nope.
once.
Not with the new updates. It's such a good
You can hold on to Bosch bikes now with the EP801 updates.
yeah,
so
no problem.
All right, I give the bike a 9.5.
You like it?
I like the
You're
bike.
weird.
I like the bike. I liked it last year. I like it this year.
All of us love this bike. Some of us love the next one. The Pole Sonne D'Enduro.
All right, did you say pole or pole?
It's Pole, whatever.
Either way, the D'Enduro bike is for sure the most unique looking eMTB CNC machine 7075 T6. It's a Bosch Performance Line CX bike, 750 battery, which has to be removed in order to be charged. I think that's a downside for sure. SRAM code R.
200 millimeters of rear wheel travel with the RockShox Vivid shock that is awesome. 190 mil fork, it's a beast, and some pretty extreme geometry.
Yes, absolutely. I think, well, the 474 reach is not necessarily extreme. However, the, I guess, 64.35 head tube angle and seat tube angle at 80 degrees is certainly up there. 1280 wheelbase.
And then look at that bottom bracket.
Pretty
height,
long
right?
and lengthy. And yeah, you've got a 371 bottom bracket height, so a bottom bracket drop of 0 static. I think it's worth mentioning with that much travel, you're sitting at 30% sag, right? 30 to 32, I think is what they ideally claim. So at sag, you're dropping quite a few millimeters, and it's gonna
Become more normal. I don't think the bottom bracket height was something that we were necessarily like, whoa, this is so high.
yeah. And it certainly didn't mean we couldn't corner the bike well, because we sure did. So let's get into the riding performance. Sean?
200 mils uphill is a couch. You do not feel anything, and traction is not a problem.
Okay.
Trophy truck, be a good way to describe it?
Yes.
Yeah, we're just flying up the hill, and whatever's in the way is moot. It's just what happened.
Given that it's got 200 mil of travel, I feel like they've done a great job with the kinematics on this to prevent that from being too soggy.
Yeah, you're not just bouncing and blowing through travel. It's not inefficient.
No.
It's a lot of travel, but it's not inefficient travel.
Drew, what do you reckon on the downhills?
I think the bike offers a pretty nice mix of like firmness and plushness. It's a pretty special feel. It doesn't like blow through the travel. It's pretty close to the Norco Range, but maybe like slightly more damped feeling. Yeah, it just made for a pretty confident, composed bike. Like I never felt like the bike got bothered. It just did everything like pretty darn well when it came to descending. It climbed pretty darn well. You know, all the numbers weren't my favorite. I also didn't like the way it looked. I didn't think it was the liveliest to get off the ground. It was kind of a lot to move. But when it came time to just like tackle a climb, turn around and charge a descent, it did that very well.
I think for me, the one place I didn't like being on this bike was in slightly choppier, flatter sections of trail if you'd lost your speed. I think getting it back up to speed when you're unable to pedal is quite difficult. I think it doesn't give you the same reward from pumping the terrain as pretty much every other bike does. So if you're on flatter terrain, it's probably not going to be the bike that I would recommend for you. But as long as you have a little bit of gravity, you can just dip the heels and absolutely charge on this thing.
So for scoring on this bike, I have to go with a 7. It doesn't do the things I like in a bike. It's not playful, it's not poppy, it doesn't reward you for effort. That said, you can point it down anything and it will eat that stuff up and give you ultimate confidence in the gnarliest of terrain.
I love the look to an extent, and I just love the overall story and what they're trying to do with it. For me, 9 for a rider who's looking to attack the terrain and descend really hard. Sean?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. I'm at an 8.5. I think the few nitpicky things that I have outside of looks would be the battery integration seems like kind of an afterthought, and then having to remove the battery every time you want to charge it, that's kind of an issue.
Absolutely. Also worth mentioning that we did have some troubles with the battery on this, just latches not releasing, maybe some small tolerance in things. Not sure if it's from an installation point of view with the Bosch system in there. I do believe that Poly quotes some very impressive tolerances on their frames, so you can assume it's not that, but yeah, we did have some troubles.
Yeah, true. I'm going to go with an 8.25. I think, like you said, some of those issues are factors for me. Some of the stuff I talk about, obviously, this is all theoretical upon the fact that Poly remains in business, they get funding and they return, but it's a unique enough bike and I'd say a good enough riding bike that we wanted to keep it in despite the recent news. So yeah, 8.25 for the long travel descending-minded e-biker.
Moving on, we've got the $9,999 Propain Ekano 2CS.
So coming in at $99.99, this is a pretty well spec'd out bike. Zeb Ultimate, Vivid Ultimate. It's the only bike on test with the SRAM Eagle powertrain, code RSC brakes, RockShox Reverb Access 170 dropper, which would have been nice to see.
Longest that they offer, sadly, still. Really hope they change that soon.
That would be nice. XO Eagle transmission T-type drivetrain. Geo I thought was pretty fair and reasonable for the category. The one standout number to me was the stack height, which did translate to some ride issues. 657 stack height was pretty tall. 471 reach was pretty solid. 451 chain stays, 1281 wheelbase.
90 Newton meters of peak torque, so slightly up from the Bosch and Shimano drive units, and then a claimed 680 watts of peak power, which is 80 more than both Bosch and Shimano. Although, as we'll get into in a little bit, not necessarily what we were feeling out on the trails. Nick, why don't you lead off with your climbing impressions on the bike?
Yeah, I didn't love this motor. This one, I think just with only 2 settings, I felt like I was kind of in between. We always were in the highest output, and it just didn't feel like it had quite the delivery that I would expect from a Bros motor system. The power is okay, and the traction's great. The seating position, the shorter front end, or the shorter reach, and the high stack just kept me lifting this thing off the ground every climb.
I definitely had to fight to keep that front end down. Granted, I mean, dropping steer tube spacers helps a bit with getting some weight transferred farther forward, but the drive unit, I felt like my thoughts and impressions on it changed more than any other bike. Like there would be times where I was like, wow, this thing's really fast and peppy, and then the pitch would change and I would be like, I'm working really hard. I was kind of all over the place with how and where it felt powerful and didn't.
Yeah, the system I think favors lower cadences, delivers a lot of torque at the lower cadence, but I think potentially it maybe isn't the best controlled system out there, and I think combining that with the lower, the high torque at low cadences is maybe where the front wheel lifting issues were coming in as well. Maybe just the torque delivery early on was more so than a lot of the other bikes. For me, I think I've spent quite a bit of time on the Eagle powertrain system and I quite enjoy it, but I think once you get up into the higher cadence range and you're really trying to hammer, it doesn't quite give you the same peak power that you might be expecting.
And quickly talking about, I guess, what you're expecting, let's talk about the auto shift ride experience. Was that always in the gear you were expecting?
No. No, I don't think the auto shift systems from any brand are there yet. It's trying to guess for you what gear you want to be in. I prefer typically a higher cadence. Makes me feel a bit sportier, I guess. Well, I just turned it off, to be honest. I don't like it. I don't trust it. I never have an issue of changing gears myself. What I do think is really good is a free shift kind of shifting without needing to pedal.
It's got a drive unit, it's got a battery, it will get you up the hill. So let's talk about where it is supposed to be riding.
It's a monster. It definitely is a very confident downhill machine. Maybe not the most forgiving rear suspension system given its 170mm travel, but definitely plenty of support. I think you can work the terrain, offset. It's relatively high weight. I was a bit surprised by the overall weight on it given its build spec. Yeah, just didn't quite set the trail alight like some of the other bikes in this category do. Sean, did you find the same?
I wasn't super stoked on the descending, but I might not have been riding it as hard or intended as it should have been. Like, I really like the new alloy version that doesn't have the SRAM motor in it. Like, I thought that was a very plush riding bike, and then to hop on this, it was much stiffer, not as forgiving, and it just didn't really move the needle for me very much.
Once you break through the platform and kind of get into the deeper suspension, I felt like that was plush. Like off drops, it felt great.
Oh, yeah.
But I just felt a little unsorted in kind of off camber, rocky, loose terrain. It just doesn't feel like you quite break through. And I mean, even with different pressures and different settings, I never really felt like I was inspired to like be playful, to pop around, even though I feel like this bike wants to do that, but yeah, it just doesn't have it there for me.
Yeah. The Propain is a tough one for me because I think people will really like it and have a great time on it. I did. But it also didn't inspire me to, when we had the free time or the free laps or like the cameras are away, I'm going to go back up and just put in a hot lap. It just wasn't a bike that I was like rushing to go try again.
Yeah. For me, I'm going to lead off the scoring. It's an 8. It's a solid, aggressive bike. Just maybe not my choice for any of the kind of categories that I have in my mind. Yeah. Nick?
I think 775 is a pretty solid place for this bike. Again, I agree. It's probably not what I love, but I could see somebody really liking this bike, and it kind of does everything okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm an 8, like with things Rob said, and then the SRAM drive system just didn't do much for me, and having to work harder up the hill compared to Bosch or Shimano just brought it down a little bit.
Yeah, true.
For me, I give the bike a solid 8. Like I said, no major glaring issues, problems, things that stand out. A really good all-around bike, and I think for riders who want to rip, have something different, unique, be able to customize some color aspects and build stuff, is a solid bike, and I think a lot of people will be stoked on it, especially if you are aggressive, shredder, downhill minded. So.
Speaking of different and unique, Rocky Mountain with their own drive unit has the Instinct PowerPlay C70, which we'll get into next.
So coming in at $94.99, the most powerful and fastest up the hill, I'd say, carbon fiber all mountain eMTB, features the Dynami 4.0 720 watt hour removable battery, the Rocky Mountain Jumbotron, which is probably my favorite display out there right now. I think super cool and really awesome to see. Shimano XT components, some nice quality Fox stuff on there as well. I thought the Geo was pretty solid. We played a little bit around. They've got a short, long chainstays, their Ride 4 geometry system, which we'll talk a little bit about. And all in all, I'd say a very capable and unique feeling bike. So let's chat about it.
Absolutely.
A really unique feeling motor. Again, we reviewed this bike last year. Similar feeling is it's there for you and it has a ton of power, but you've got to put the work in too. There's not a lot of soft pedal on this bike.
I disagree.
See, I don't know if it's just our weight differences, but
I'm more on Nick's side. You get rewarded the more effort you put into it.
Yeah, you do, but I think you can soft pedal and keep up with people on other systems.
Yeah.
Like maybe to unlock the full power out of it, you do need to give it a bit of input, but it's got so much power that even if you're soft pedaling and only getting half of the power, you're still keeping up with everyone else.
And then to mention on the drive unit, it is more of a maintenance hog than the other drive units. I had to take this motor covers off, completely clean the system, re-oil or lube the chain, the drive units. The mud is very sticky and it has been very wet. We've been power washing 10 times a day. So we accelerated the service interval quite a bit.
Absolutely.
But it did take quite a bit more service, and it sounds terrible if that system is not running smooth.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, it's kind of a high pivot system. It's got a couple of cogs within its motor cover. It's the only system that the chain runs actually through the motor housing, I guess. Definitely very unique, and because of that, it has two cogs that mud can get into and access. They're a little bit more tucked away than the likes of the Norco high pivot system on that. Yeah, it certainly does require a little bit more maintenance, and you're going to have to pop off that cover. It's not difficult maintenance to do, right? No. But if you're on a particularly muddy, claggy mud kind of day, you may run into some issues with the chain pulling that mud through and making things sound pretty rough in there. We did also have a slight issue, which we believe, after getting some feedback from Rocky Mountain, to have been the clutch bearing, which was, I think, slipping, essentially. It started off, I was hopping on the bike to check the suspension setup statically, maybe loading the pedals slightly, and the motor just sounded like something slipped, made a horrible noise. And Rocky says that this is the first time that they've experienced that problem on a motor that hasn't seen, multiple thousands of miles. I'd say don't worry about it, and I've recommended this system maybe more in the altitude to some friends in the past, and I've only had positive feedback from them, because the power that this thing delivers is phenomenal, and you can outclimb any other system by far.
It's also the only bike that on test with 170mm cranks.
Yes.
And only takes race face cinch, so you really have limited options to shrink the...
And the bottom bracket is quite low, now that I think about it. Not helped, of course, by the fact that we opted to go for the ride forward position in the low setting, which puts those cranks the closest to the ground. You can, of course, if you are a rider who favors more chunky climbing ability, stick it into the steepest, highest position of that and get a little bit more clearance, but it's still not a lot of clearance, right?
It's an interesting bike in that the travel doesn't really represent the capabilities. I feel that the bike does a much better job of just plowing over stuff and really smoothing it out. And I think that's probably indicative of the suspension platform. I would say for the amount of travel, we can ride this bike harder, faster, and down gnarlier stuff without it being bothered than any other bike in a 140, even up to maybe even a 160
Some of the 160s,
platform. It's crazy.
Yeah, I came off this bike and you just get to the bottom and you're like, this is not a 140 bike. Like, this is way beyond that.
I was riding some of the free ride features here at the bike park on it and forgot completely that I was on a trail bike. It's not, it's just a very well sorted. But
I mean, they're from BC, right? And I mean, that's at home and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think it'd be a disservice for us to say that this is a trail bike by any means. Trail
Duro, as you've continued
I think like enduro, really.
Enduro race bike.
It has the reserves, it has the suspension performance over the rough stuff. I think just forget about that travel number defining what the bike can do, and consider it more of an enduro bike, and you're probably going to be pretty happy with it.
Okay.
So standouts, final score, ideal consumer rider for this bike?
Yeah, so I gave this bike a 7.75. I think some of the motor issues we saw and the dealer network may be a holdup for me. But otherwise, the bike, it has a lot of power. It rides really well. It overguns. It's bigger than you think it's going to be. It's an impressive bike, so 7.75.
Yeah, for me, I think the drive system may be worth moving to be nearer a Rocky Mountain dealer, just because it's that good. So it's an 8.5 as an overall bike. I think I'd probably opt to go for the altitude if it were me, but this altitude instinct, is still absolutely a bike that you can charge hard on, and yeah, consider it more of a light enduro bike, and you're going to be very happy with it, I think. Sean?
I'm at an 8. I think the Jumbotron should be the standard for display integrations on every bike. That's just me. Power is second to none, but obviously the motor issues that we've experienced, plus in the past, that's an issue. And then the spec to value ratio is not as good as some of the other bikes on test.
No, but do you think it detriments the overall feeling of quality when you're riding it?
No. It's just that perceived value you get.
Absolutely, yeah, I understand. One thing worth noting, there is no app, I believe, for this bike. So everything you've got to do to it has to be done within that Jumbotron. So it's a good job. It's a very good system.
I'd be confident putting this thing at an 8. It's a really good bike, and I think for certain terrain and riders, it will absolutely excel and deliver a very awesome ride experience.
Speaking of excelling, I think we have 5 bikes in this 14 bike roundup that are very much deserved of an award. So let's move on and hand some of those out, I reckon.
I think before we go there, we maybe have a quick chat. If you guys had an ideal bike, what drive unit would you want to see on that bike?
It's a tough one.
My favorite bike is not my favorite motor system.
Things have come a long way.
Is
My
removable
favorite bike
battery
is
a
not
must-have?
my favorite
It?
motor
Like,
system.
things
We're
have come a
talking
long way.
fractional battery,
Whoa. As you can imagine, this conversation took a detour, and this video is already long enough. So we pulled the 15-minute discussion where we talked about drive units, features, things we'd like to see improved on e-bikes from the industry, and made it its own separate video, which we will link above as well as down below in the description. We definitely think it's a worthwhile conversation, as it's something we've talked about for a very long time, many different times. So check that video out when you're done with this. But hopefully, if you guys have made it this long, you're still here and you're ready for the awards ceremony. So back to the show.
We have decided that in an effort to kind of best serve you guys and give some feedback that might be the most applicable and helpful, we've broken down into several categories based on types of rider and terrain, because obviously a 200mm bike might not be the best for you, and so giving one award isn't really going to be helpful. And so with that in mind, let's kind of talk about the different categories. So the first category, you want to lead that off for the trail?
Absolutely. So this is going to be the bike that is best suited to maybe less aggressive, less gnarly terrain, but will cover miles really well. Certainly a good do-it-all light-duty bike. And for that, we're going to award the Cannondale Moterra SL1 as our trail bike pick for the year.
Next category up.
Moving on, we have got the all-rounder pick. Considering value in mind, it's a bike that's going to do everything well, and really just a bike that all of us would recommend, probably most likely to the widest variety of people. And for that, Sean, what have we chosen?
The Ari Timp Peak.
Okay. I would say that's pretty close to in line with last year. Best bang for the buck. Once again, still a really good value and still a very well-rounded, capable, and I would say on top of everything else, fun enduro all-mountain e-bike.
But maybe even better value this year. Sub $6,000 category, a bike that really stood out to us as the budget pick, the actual best bang for the buck in our 2024 e-bike shootout is
The Canyon. What a bike.
Canyon Strive On.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even budget aside, I think that was like one of the bikes where we talked about, like, you know, some of the bikes had a price, a sub 6K vote on the number scale, and then an overall number on the vote scale. And I think that was like the only bike that was like, it only needs one number. We don't have to vote on it based in the sub 6K group. It's good enough to even hang with some of the 10K bikes. So yeah, the Strive On is an absolute ripper, and congrats to Canyon.
Absolutely. Now, moving on, we're in a racing scenario, we're up against the clock, and we want to set the fastest time. I don't know if there's any discussion needed for the bike that at least me and you are going to pick, but I think we agreed overall the racer pick. Drew.
Yeah, absolutely. The racer pick is the Orbea Wild. I think that offers the widest range of performance enhancements, you could call it. I mean, from geo to platform to the way that it wants you to ride. I mean, it really inspires you to charge and hammer, and when the race clock is going, you are in that mindset, right? It might not be your everyday mindset, but when the clock's on, that bike will reward.
I mean,
Absolutely.
it's the sharpest knife in the toolbox.
Every day is race day
Yeah.
on the Orbea Wild. What a sweet bike. Okay, moving on, and maybe the clock isn't the thing that you're trying to beat, but you just want to go out there, puck the biggest drops, right, the roughest, gnarliest rock gardens and trails, and just attack everything in a downhill mindset. The best downhill bike we've got on test.
We've got the Norco Range VLT.
Absolutely. Still a bike that climbs pretty well, but when it starts going downhill, a bike that you can let open the taps and absolutely charge on. Really impressive what Norco has done with that.
Absolutely, yeah. It'll grapple the climbs and pound the descents. That thing is an absolute monster.
And save you on some mishaps.
And then, last but not least, a bike that can almost hang on to the Norco on the way down, almost hang on to the Cannondale on the way up, just really does a great job of absolutely everything, and at $9,999 with the spec that it's got, also represents reasonable value given its overall high quality. Drew, I'll let you hand out this one to maybe your favorite bike ever.
The Pivot Shuttle LT. Gosh, I really, really like that bike. Still, it's been a couple years now, and the EP801 upgrade has just made it better. Like I said, that's if I'm unsure of something, if I'm having an off day and I want to cruise, if I'm feeling frisky and I want to put down a heater, that bike for me does so much as a, I don't know.
The most versatile
it's just so
e-bike.
versatile.
Yeah,
It's
right?
so versatile, and I love it. Sean?
Absolutely. It's
Okay.
comfortable, playful, gets you up the hill.
And I don't
And
think
a
we're out of the range on price either anymore.
Certainly. I mean, you know, it's everything's under 10K in this year's shootout, so you know, it's definitely not a 10K bike that has performance suspension or SLX components. I mean, you're getting factory Kashima XTR. I mean, you know, it's still
A big
10
battery
grand,
even.
but you're
Yes.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is it's got a bigger battery than the Orbea. You guys, you know, we were just talking about in the last award, but overall solid bike, and hopefully each of those little subcategories helps focus you guys into what type of rider or intentions you have on the trail. That's kind of the goal, was to really kind of help you narrow down what type of rider, what type of terrain you are, and make the best decision for you guys. Finally, we would really like to extend a huge thanks not only to you guys, the viewers, your comments, your engagement. You guys are what make this happen, along with the support from the awesome brands. Howler Bike Park for hosting us, Fox Racing for kitting us out with gear, Schwalbe for their amazing tires that have helped us stay as upright as we can here in the slop. Again, without all these brands and you guys, this sort of stuff wouldn't happen. It is a huge undertaking, physically, mentally, financially. So thank you guys so much for allowing us to do this, and hopefully we've offered you guys some good insight and help. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you guys out on the trails.